Sucheta, thanks Debashish, and thank you, all of you, for coming over this afternoon. My involvement with the right to dignity, with the Society for the Right to Die with Dignity, is mostly accidental, where I was dragged kicking and screaming by Suren Dhelia into that organization. Before I begin, let me tell you a few things. The Society for the the Society for the Right to Die with Dignity is an organization that was formed by Minu Masani, who was 3-time MP and helped form the Swatantra Party before Mrs. Gandhi decided to put all the members of the Swatantra Party into prison. Minu Masani was a visionary, and he believed in a liberal society, and that's why I formed the liberal society, the Indian Liberal Society in India. And then he formed the Society for the Right to Die with Dignity. To raise funds for the society, he screened a movie, which I've asked Sucheta one of these days will screen over here. It was a movie which I think it won a couple of Academy Awards. It was called Whose Life Is It Anyway? And I think anyone who wants to understand the subject should watch that film. In India, we've been talking about the right to die with dignity for almost over 20 years, when all of a sudden one case galvanized everyone and focused attention on this subject. And the issue was Aruna Shanbag. Aruna Shanbag was in a very unfortunate situation where she was a nurse, sexually assaulted, and then slipped into what is known as persistent vegetative state for 42 years. And whenever you come across a situation where a person is in a vegetative state, people start asking the question, is it right? Is it justifiable? Is it necessary for society to allow such a person to be kept artificially alive? Okay. How many people in this group think that such a person should be allowed to die? Just raise your hands. Okay. How many people think that they should not be allowed to die? Anyone? The right to life? That these laws can be misused? That these laws can be misused? That, who are you? Are you God to decide that someone should die? Isn't there any champion for that kind of side, that kind of argument? Yeah, you're taking the decision, not that person. The answer is no. Okay? So, the person's a vegetative state, the person can't take a decision. So I'm asking you, what would your decision be? Would you like the person to die, or not to be kept alive artificially, or would you like the person to be kept alive as long as God allows you to keep that person alive? So you are against putting a person to death, as an outsider taking a decision for someone. Yes. Okay, anyone else in that side? We can decide in advance. Maybe yes, but I'm asking you. Now we are donating so many bodies. I granted, those issues are going to be taken by Dr. Dhelia later. My question is only one. How many people believe that under the present circumstances, I am in a vegetative state, I can't tell you what is right and wrong for me? At that time, does anyone who is a relative or a friend have the right to say, enough is enough, let him die? You believe. Okay, good. Anyone who believes that it should not be done.
So it depends on the suffering of the person. If the person say is
Vegetative state. There is no, the person does not, no pain. The person is a vegetable. The person does not know pain. The person can't think. The person can't decide. The person only has those involuntary movements of the body, whether it's passing of fluids or it's swallowing food. Those are automatic involuntary actions of the muscle of the body. And this question, and I'm taking on the other side first, and this question of should a person take such a decision is a painful question. It's a very painful question. Because suddenly you are playing God. But then, sometimes you have to play God whenever you want to interfere with whatever nature does. Nature has given you a boil. Someone decides to cauterize the boil, he's playing God. You're coming in the way of nature. And here was a girl. Life was not easy for her. It was unfair to her. She went into a vegetative state. And the big question that came up, thanks to a girl called Pinky Virani, who said she was a friend in the legal affidavits. She was a journalist and said that she should be allowed to die. The courts had a very difficult time to arrive at a decision. Here was a journalist, and here was a normal human reaction that a person should not suffer much. In this case, the suffering was not there because the person was incapable of thinking. And I think somewhere the case went off track. The issues with Aruna Shanbag's case were two. One, should she be allowed to die? There was a second question which nobody asked, is should she be allowed to occupy a hospital bed that are meant for other patients? A hospital bed is meant for patients who can be treated and can be cured, or at least you hope that they'll be cured. When that hope goes away, should you block a hospital bed? And this is true of a Chhagan Bhujbul who occupies a hospital bed for his convenience, or it's true of an MP who's been there on a respirator at taxpayers' money for several years in another part of the country. A hospital bed in a country like India, which is in short supply, is a very valuable asset. If you want to take care of the person, take him home. Take him to a sanatorium, not to a hospital. Care can be shown in different ways. When you block a hospital bed, it's not care. It's disregard for care, for the sake of one person. Leaving aside that question, we come back here again. When Aruna Shanbag went into coma, as I said, there was a case, and the Supreme Court immediately appointed a medical panel to examine her, and in 2011, the court rejected Pinky's request that Aruna Shanbag be allowed to die. But what is interesting in this court judgment is that even though it rejected Pinky Virani's petition, there were lines in the judgment that suggest that an overhaul of thinking around human beings is imperative today. Let's go through the judgments. By implication, it accepts the role of a living will on page 27 and 28 of the judgment. And what does the judgment say? If the patient has not previously expressed a wish not to have life-sustaining treatments in the case of futile care or a persistent vegetative state, should his or her wishes be respected when the situation arises? I have not left behind a living will, and I am in PVS, persistent vegetative state. the question arises whether I should be allowed to live. Second, in case a person has not previously expressed such a wish, if his family or next of kin makes a request to withhold or withdraw futile life-sustaining treatments, should their wishes be respected, is what the court asked again. Okay, there's no living will. Can my wife, my father, my mother, my brother, my sister, can any one of my direct relatives take a decision on my behalf? And that is what the court asked. It's a question for which it did not have an answer, but it raised the question. And sometimes raising questions is as important as giving answers. Aruna Shanbag has been abandoned. These are the court's words. Aruna Shanbag has been abandoned by a family and is being looked after for the last 37 years by the staff of KEM. Who should take decisions on her behalf? And then the court says, we have no indication of Aruna Shanbag's views or wishes with respect to life-sustaining treatments for a permanent vegetative state. Any decision regarding a treatment will have to be taken by a surrogate. The staff of the KEM have looked after for 37 years. We believe that the dean of the KEM hospital, representing the staff of the hospital, is an appropriate surrogate. By implication, the court said that had Aruna Shanbag left behind a living will, maybe it could have been considered. By raising the question, it has thrown in the question of a living will. And the unfortunate thing is that while the government has announced its desire to introduce a bill on euthanasia, it does not want to discuss the living will. I do believe that before euthanasia can be discussed, the living will is important. The living will is important only because today I'm alive and my doctor tells me that, look, you've got a tumor, please get operated. And I say, no, I don't want any operation. There is nothing on earth that can make the doctor compel me to go undergo an operation. If I do not consent to a line of treatment, whether it's a cough syrup or an operation, I'm within my rights to refuse such treatment. If I have the right to decide on my treatment while I'm alive, why can't I decide when I'm mentally sound and alive and articulate? Why can't I decide that in case I go into a coma, in case I'm unable to communicate, I do not want this line of treatment? I can do that. I can take that decision now. Why can't I decide for myself at some point in the future also? Why can't I create a power of attorney giving the authority to my doctor, to my lawyer, to anyone to take decisions for me along these lines? Logically, these are things that should be allowed. Many countries of the world have allowed it either under the nomenclature of living will or as an advance directive, where you direct the government, you direct the courts, you direct the hospital, you direct your family to follow these instructions. The living will is imperative, because we believe that if I have the right to live, I have the right to decide how I want to live. If I have the right to decide how I want to live, I have the right to decide what kind of treatment I do not want, now or in the future. I cannot and I do not want someone else to decide on my behalf. They can recommend to me, they can suggest to me, but the decision is mine. Which is why the living will is important. The Supreme Court has indirectly suggested, yes, it should be allowed. It has sanctity by implication, not categorically. It is time it was made a law. Unfortunately, the government has clearly stated it's not interested in discussing the living will at this stage, which is an unfortunate thing. Finally, there are 2 points I want to make. It's a belief I have had right from the time I was a teenager. I was very influenced by a French philosopher, poet, writer called Albert Camus. And in one of his essays, Albert Camus, the essay is called Absurd Reasoning, Albert Camus makes a very interesting argument. And the argument is simply this. And he says, when all questions have been asked and all answers have been given, there is still one question that will never get answered. And that question is life worth living? He said that the reason the question cannot be answered is because the question is absurd. Why is it absurd? He says, because if life is worth living, you will not ask the question. And if life is not worth living, you should not be alive to ask the question. Life has its own complications, its own hidden contradictions. And the only justification at the end of it all is, can you make life meaningful? Can you reduce pain? Can you give life the dignity that it is supposed to have? Mahatma Gandhi believed that if there's a choice between dignity and death, between pain and death, he would opt for death. Not just for animal, but also for a human being. Most of these discussions will be handled by Dr. Suren Dhelia. For 2 reasons, he dragged me into this position. This is my revenge. The second is because he's a doctor. A doctor is critical because he is the man who certifies life at the time of birth and who certifies the cessation of life. There are times when a doctor is the most qualified to talk about the living will, euthanasia, and matters of life and death. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhaskar, for a wonderful presentation, and may I now invite Dr. Dhelia.
At the outset, I would like to thank Moneylife Foundation and Silver Innings for giving me this opportunity to share my views about living will and euthanasia. If you have seen the present bill whereby the government is asking for public opinion and comments, it clearly says no to living will. It is explicitly stated in para 11, I will show you that living will is null and void, it has no locus standi. With this background, the question comes, shall we really discuss living will? The answer is yes. Bhaskar has already shown that if Aruna Shanbag had executed a living will, probably the Supreme Court would have considered that living will. I thought before we talk about living will, let's touch the subject of euthanasia, because both of them are very closely related. What is euthanasia? What is mercy killing? It's deliberate killing of a person for the benefit of that person. It's gentle, peaceful end of a life who is terminally ill, who is suffering, who is having intense pain and agony. So it's killing a person, yes, but in the interest of that person. That's euthanasia. In case euthanasia is legalized, who would be the candidates for euthanasia? Obviously, those who are having incurable illness, terminal illness, resulting into intense pain, agony, loss of control over body functions, loss of higher functions of the brain like perceiving, thinking, judging, planning. So, the candidates who would be for euthanasia are AIDS sufferers, cancer victims, patients of Alzheimer's. What are the types of euthanasia? Euthanasia could be voluntary euthanasia, where a person who is mentally competent asks for it. मेरी पीड़ा इतनी असहनीय है कि please put an end to my life. I can't suffer like this. All attempts to help me have failed. And please give me a peaceful exit. That's voluntary euthanasia, euthanasia carried out with consent of the person. As opposed to this, there is non-voluntary euthanasia where consent is not there. A patient is terminally ill, patient is suffering, and euthanasia is carried out without his consent or without the person expressing his desire to do so. Now, euthanasia could be active euthanasia, euthanasia could be passive euthanasia. What is active euthanasia? In active euthanasia, a lethal dose of a medicine is given to the patient with the stated aim of ending his life. That's active euthanasia. What is passive euthanasia? In passive euthanasia, suppose a person has respiratory arrest, he can't breathe and he needs ventilator. So not putting this patient on ventilator would amount to passive euthanasia. Or suppose a person is on ventilator and finally the doctors have realized that this is not going to be of any help. They take him off the ventilator. So that is passive euthanasia. So either withdrawal of treatment, which is necessary to keep the person alive, or withdrawing the treatment that is keeping the patient alive, that would amount to passive euthanasia. Then there is one more term, physician assisted suicide. Suicide is intentional killing of self. And suicide is not a crime. Failed suicide is a crime. Attempted suicide that has failed is a crime under section 309 of Indian Penal Code. In physician assisted suicide, the terminally ill person is prescribed medication which will end his life, but physician cannot administer this. Physician is only assisting him. The person has to take it himself. So it's physician assisted suicide. So whether it is euthanasia or physician assisted suicide, both of them result into death. The only difference is who pulls the plug. What's the legal status of euthanasia? Euthanasia, physician assisted suicide, is legal in 5 states of America: Washington, Oregon, Vermont, New Mexico, and Montana. And thanks to a young lady called Brittany Menard. Today, I don't know if Sucheta is chosen 9th of June today for this very reason. Today it has become legal in California. Yeah. So now 6 states of America. In Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide both are legal. And Switzerland, euthanasia is unlawful, but physician-assisted suicide is legal. And there is an organization called Dignitas that helps terminally ill patients, irrespective of their country, to come if they are having terminal illness, they are allowed to die. It has to be physician assisted suicide. The patient has to take the lethal dose of the medication himself or herself. And suppose somebody has advanced cancer and in Dignitas he is given lethal dose of a medicine and he dies. What is the cause of death now? What's the cause of death in this case? The poison that has been given to the patient? No. Technically, maybe yes, but then the cause of death that goes on the death certificate is the original disease, say advanced cancer or Alzheimer or whatever. So, what are the options for a terminally ill person? One is make the best use of medical intervention and medical technology to prolong the process of dying. The second is allow the patient a slow lingering death. And the third option, and in my opinion the best option, is to try and help him relieve, give him a peaceful exit, relieve him from his sufferings. In my opinion, a hopelessly ill person should be allowed to choose peaceful, dignified, quick and certain death in the presence of his loved ones. Brittany Menard, she was in California, about 29-year-old. She had brain tumor. She was suffering. The suffering was intense. She wanted to end her life. When she wanted to do it, she wanted to end her life in the manner she thought fit. But she was in California and there it was not legal. So she moved to Oregon where it was legal. She got a prescription drug and she decided to take it on a particular day in the presence of her close relatives, her mother, her stepfather, her in the arms of her husband and her loved ones, and she could say goodbye to them. But today, death has been centralized, death has been medicalized, death has been made miserable and costly. Hospitals say, we don't allow you to die. We have to treat you, even if we know the treatment is futile. A person is not allowed to die at home. You have to die in the hospital, centralized death. So you have got to die in the hospital. In the hospital, you are not allowed to die on the floor, not in the room. You have got to die in ICU. With strangers around you, machines around you, with tubes in all the natural orifices and maybe a number of orifices that are not natural. Maybe a tracheostomy, maybe a central line. Now coming to the question of living will and autonomy. What is autonomy? We have constitutionally protected liberty to say no to unwanted medical treatment, even if it amounts to death. If I see a patient of severe heart attack, blood pressure going down, pulse rapid, threaty, and I know he is going to die unless he is put in the hospital in the ICU, I tell him, boss, आपको तुरंत hospital में भर्ती होने की ज़रूरत है. He says no, and he dies. Is it legal or illegal? This is perfectly legal, because a person who is mentally competent, he has every right to decide what medical treatment he wants or what medical treatment he does not want. So he is perfectly within his right to say no to unwanted medical treatment. And now the question comes, what if the patient is not mentally competent? if the patient is in coma, if the patient is having dementia, what happens then? Well, there is a thing called advance directive. A mentally competent person can spell out the medical treatment, the line of treatment that he wants or he doesn't want in case he becomes mentally incompetent, in case he loses his capacity to make decisions or to convey his decisions, to communicate his decisions. So there comes advance directive. So an advance directive is a document that enables a competent person. So one has to be mentally competent to execute advance directive. An advance directive could take two forms. One, it could be in the form of a living will, wherein the person says, in case I am not mentally competent, in case I am not able to make decisions, in case I am not able to convey decisions regarding my medical treatment, the following things may be offered to me and the following things should not be offered to me. But living will is not equal to euthanasia. A person can very well say, if I am in coma, if I have terminal illness, please do everything possible under the sun to keep me alive till I am dead, even if it amounts to lot of pain, lot of suffering, lot of expenses. So, living will, you spell out what you want, what you don't want when you lose your capacity to take decisions. And the other form of advance directive is medical power of attorney. In medical power of attorney, you appoint a surrogate to take decisions on your behalf when you are not able to take decisions, when you are not able to convey decisions. So you appoint a surrogate. For example, I have appointed my daughters as surrogate to take decisions on my behalf. God forbid if I am in a condition where I can't take decisions about my medical treatment. So that's medical power of attorney. Most of you would have heard Dr. Death, Dr. Jack Kevorkian. He was a qualified doctor. He helped and he confessed to having helped 130 persons who were terminally ill to end their life. And finally, when he was offering active euthanasia to one of his patients, it was shown live on the TV and he was convicted of second-degree murder. And after he was convicted, he had no regret, no remorse. His statement, my only intent was to relieve their pain and suffering. Their death was just an unfortunate but necessary consequence of the only way it could be done. This is what the bill is. Medical treatment of terminally ill patients, para 11 reads. Living will or medical power of attorney executed by the person shall be void and of no effect and shall not be binding on any medical practitioner. So the question comes, do we still execute a living will? Do we still appoint a surrogate to take decisions on our behalf? Terry's case is unique. Around the age of 30, she had cardiac arrest. By the time she could be revived, her brain had stopped functioning. She was in persistent vegetative state like Aruna Shanbag. And the case went on for 15 long years, starting from lower courts of America, going to the Supreme Court of America and involving the then President of America, George W. Bush. Why? Because Terry had not executed a living will. Had she executed a living will, probably all this could have been avoided. Her husband wanted that the feeding tube should be out. He said, I know my wife, she would have not liked to live in this condition. She would have liked the tube to be out and she would have liked a peaceful exit. But her parents, they said no. She would have liked to continue living. So finally this went to Supreme Court and finally the feeding tube was removed and she was allowed to die. But the important point I am trying to stress is, had she executed a living will, probably things would have been different and better for her. Bhaskar has already talked about Aruna Shanbag and Supreme Court's judgment, where it is implied that had Aruna Shanbag executed a living will, probably the court would have considered the living will and might have gone by it. Again, he has shown in next again the Supreme Court goes further and says that in absence of living will, has she executed a medical power of attorney? In case she had executed a medical power of attorney, appointing a surrogate to take decisions on her behalf, probably the court would have considered that. Now, since there was no surrogate appointed by her, the court said Pinky Virani, who filed the petition, has no locus standi. Next friend would be KEM Hospital nurses, staff, dean, who were taking care of her, and that's why their opinion was sought. Brittany Menard, I have already spoken about her. Menard wrote her in final Facebook post, "Goodbye to all my dear friends and family that I love. Today is the day I have chosen to pass away with dignity in the face of my terminal illness. This terrible brain cancer that has taken so much from me, but would have taken so much more." This is from CNN, day before yesterday, her husband writing, "A little more than 18 months ago, I held my wife Brittany Menard in my arms as she fell asleep and passed away peacefully. She did so after consuming aid-in-dying medication instead of allowing brain cancer to continue, imposing its slow and tortuous death upon her. This Thursday, today, a California law will go into effect that will give a terminally ill individual who qualifies the ability to request aid-in-dying medication, letting them also have the option of a similarly gentle passing if it becomes necessary." Report of Institution of Medical Ethics. "A doctor working in good conscience is ethically justified in assisting death if the need to relieve intense and unnecessary pain or distress caused by incurable diseases greatly outweighs the benefit to the patient of further prolonging life." Christian Barnard, the famous heart surgeon, he says, "I have learned from life in medicine that death is not always an enemy. At times, it's good medical treatment. It achieves what medicine cannot. It stops suffering." Gandhiji, the icon of ahimsa, non-violence. I'll just quickly read his views on euthanasia, which might surprise some of you if you have not heard them earlier. "A calf having been maimed lay in agony in the ashram, and despite all possible treatment and nursing, the surgeon declared the case to be past help and hope. The animal suffering was very acute. In the circumstances," Gandhiji says, "I felt that humanity demanded that the agony should be ended by ending life itself. The matter was placed before the whole ashram. Finally, in all humility, but with the cleanest of convictions, I got in my presence a doctor to administer the calf a quietus by means of a poison injection, and the whole thing was over in less than 2 minutes." He goes further, "Would I apply to human beings the principle that I have enunciated in connection with the calf? Would I like it to be applied in my own case? My reply is yes. Just as a surgeon does not commit hinsa when he uses his knife on his patient's body for the patient's benefit, similarly, one may find it necessary under certain imperative circumstances to go a step further and sever life from the body in the interest of the sufferer. So the point is, euthanasia should be allowed, physician-assisted suicide should be allowed. When I say euthanasia should be allowed, I mean voluntary euthanasia should be allowed. And whatever can be used can always be misused. So you have got to have proper guidelines for the practice of euthanasia. You have got to have appropriate safeguards to prevent its misuse, and you have got to have severe punishment for infringement of this law. The passive euthanasia Bhaskar was talking about, which has been legalized by Honorable Supreme Court of India in March 2011, I don't know how many have used it. The procedure is so lengthy. You approach High Court of the state where the terminally ill patient is there. The Chief Justice of that High Court is going to appoint a bench consisting of at least 2 judges. This bench is going to appoint a medical specialist committee who will go into merits and demerits of the case and submit its report to the court. And so probably I think from March 11 to March 16, if my mathematics is right, probably 5 years. Probably not a single case has approached any high court. But passive euthanasia keeps happening behind closed doors. Most hospitals, most doctors are kind. If a patient is in ICU, the patient is terminally ill, all attempts to help the patient have failed. Most hospital doctors would talk to the relatives, explain to the relatives whatever was worth doing, we have done, and there is nothing more we can do. If you want, we can take the patient off the life support system and let the patient die. This happens covertly almost every day, but on the hospital records this cannot go. On the hospital record, the patient dies a natural death and then he is removed from the life support system. So, jatasya hi dhruv mrityu. Acceptance of mortality must lie at the center of the way we treat the dying. You know, our medical training, we must continue to treat our patients. We must continue as long as we can. We must prolong life as long as we can. We are never taught how to teach our patients how to face death. So euthanasia is all about end of life choices. Depriving someone of choices and dignity in the final chapters of his life is morally and ethically wrong. I believe voluntary euthanasia for the dying should be removed from the legal classification of murder and recognized as a justifiable act of compassion. We should enjoy a right, the right not to be forced to suffer. It should be considered a crime to force someone to exist and suffer who with justification does not wish to continue to live. So euthanasia is not about killing someone. Euthanasia is about to end a dead-end survival. As someone has said, हर पल में प्यार है, हर लम्हे में खुशी, खो दो तो यादें हैं, जी लो तो जिंदगी. यह मत पूछो कि जिंदगी में कितने पल हैं, पर यह देखो हर पल में कितनी जिंदगी है. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And